I sometimes visited my granddad's grave. Admittedly, not as much as I probably should have, but I always used to make the effort on special dates, such as Christmas and his birthday. The cemetery was split into two halves. The newer graves were close to the path, and the older graves, and I'm talking about ones that are centuries old, were beyond this crumbling knee-high stone wall. That side of the cemetery was as you'd expect it to be. The only flowers found there were weeds, and most of the gravestones were so worn away that the inscriptions were illegible. I'd never seen anyone on that side of the wall before, at least not until the last time I visited my granddad's grave. It was a cold, gloomy midwinter's day. Looked like it could start raining at any moment, so it wasn't surprising that, apart from an elderly woman who was leaving as I went in, no one else was there. It was close to Christmas, so I had some holly I wanted to leave on my granddad's tombstone so it would look presentable for when my grandmother and other relatives visited on Christmas morning. I stayed there about 10 minutes, just reflecting on my granddad's life and things like that. When I was ready to leave, I said goodbye to my granddad and walked around the tombstones and over to the path. I just started walking along it when I noticed something over in the old part of the cemetery. There was a man over there. He was sitting in the long grass next to a worn tombstone. He had his arms crossed and was completely still. I thought this was strange, but I just wanted to get going, so I walked away, quickening my pace when it started raining. The parking lot was on the other side of the cemetery, so by the time I reached my car, I was soaked. I was mad at myself for not taking an umbrella. I frantically searched my jacket pocket for my car keys, but I couldn't find them. Panicked, I tried to recall the last time I had them. I definitely put them in my pocket after locking my car. The only other time I'd been in my pocket was to get a Kleenex to brush dirt off my granddad's tombstone. It became obvious that my keys must have fallen out of my pocket then. I rushed back along the path in the rain, feeling annoyed with myself. As I reached the tombstone, I searched around for the keys. I checked all around the area, but I couldn't find them. Worst of all, I couldn't even call my friend for help as I left my phone in the car. I was really furious with myself, and it was getting late, and the cemetery office was closed. I thought I was just going to have to walk in the rain to the closest store. Then suddenly, I heard a cough. I looked up and saw that man who'd been at the old cemetery leaning over the wall. He was looking over at me and seemed completely unfazed by the rain. I asked him if he had a phone I could borrow, but he continued staring at me. I wasn't in the mood to humor some old man, so I just nodded and continued walking. As I moved, I heard footsteps behind me, but they sounded off. I turned and saw that man scuttling toward me. That's the only way of describing it. It was like how a bug would move. As soon as he saw me, he stood still and looked at me with this empty glare. This was starting to creep me out, so I turned and quickened my pace, but as soon as I started moving, I heard the same strange scuttling sounds coming from behind me. I slowed down enough to look over my shoulder and saw him again stop and gaze back at me. It was as if he was eagerly waiting for me to turn back around so he could move again. I started running after that, and I didn't stop running until the cemetery was out of sight. When I did turn back around, I couldn't see the man anymore. I went into the first grocery store that I found and asked to use the phone. I called my friend who was a mechanic to come help tow my car. He picked me up from the store and drove me to the parking lot. He got out, looked at the car, and just gave me this annoyed look. I got out too and followed his gaze. That's when I saw that hanging from the driver's side door were my car keys. I checked it. There was no chance that I left those keys there. I explained this to him and told him about the man, but at this point, he was so angry I'd made him go out there for nothing that he didn't listen. As I got in my car and peered through the window, I saw him, standing on the pathway in the cemetery, unflinching and staring straight at me. It was that man. I drove out of there and I haven't been back since. I know that man took my keys to make me go back, to make me play his weird game. I don't know why he was there or why he did what he did, but the whole thing still gives me chills. I used to rent an apartment on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and I think that most of this was down to the location. It wasn't a terrible apartment or anything, but it was next to a cemetery. This didn't really bother me, as we all lived and died. I didn't view it as anything to be fearful of. Hey, if it saved me $200 a month in rent by living there over somewhere else, then it made sense. I worked at this bar in town, and on weekends, it was normal for me not to get home until 4 or 5 in the morning. This happened after one of my shifts. My coworker dropped me next to the cemetery, and as I said my goodbyes to her and was about to cross the street over to my apartment, I saw something on the stone steps. It was a yellow envelope, and written on it was a name. My name. I knew this could have been a coincidence, but it still gave me the creeps. I left the envelope where it was and just thought about getting home as quickly as I could. Only, as I turned to leave, I heard something behind me. The heavy iron gates creaked. My gaze shot toward them, and standing there, a hand gripped around one of the iron spirals, was a little boy, say 7 or 8. He was in a worn-looking black jacket, and tufts of brown hair poked out from beneath his baseball cap. It was far too early for this kid to be here alone. I approached him with a smile and calmly asked him if his mommy or daddy were around. He shook his head and peered down at the steps. He was looking at where the envelope was. I asked him where he lived and if he wanted me to walk him home. Again, he shook his head and quietly told me that his parents weren't home and that he liked it in the cemetery as he had friends there. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and stroked something. I glimpsed gray fur, but I couldn't make out what it was. Then he gave me this creepy smile, said bye to me, and then he said my name. I was still trying to make sense of this as he turned and ran off across the cemetery. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to just walk off and leave that kid there, but I also didn't want to run after him. It was all making me feel uncomfortable, especially as he knew my name. I don't know if it was the right decision or not, but I decided to go home. I had the perfect view of the cemetery gates from my living room window, so I looked out and saw that the boy had gone. I figured he'd just gone home, and I tried to push that envelope and that boy out of my thoughts. I went to sleep and didn't wake up until early that afternoon. I made myself something to eat and was chatting with my roommate when I noticed her staring out of the living room window. I asked her what was up, and she told me to come take a look. I joined her, and my heart began to pound when I saw him. That little boy was sitting on the top step. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a yellow envelope, and with his other hand, he was stroking an animal that was on his lap. I squinted my eyes to get a closer look, and so did my friend. Then she broke the silence by saying, "That looks like a rat he's petting, right?" I nodded in agreement, too stunned to speak. My friend turned away, but I kept on looking. That's when I saw that boy peer up at my window, and holding the envelope, he gave me a creepy smile. I explained to my friend what happened and made her come outside with me to the cemetery. When we got there, the boy had gone, and there was no one else around. It was my friend who peered down at the step and pointed at something. It was a yellow envelope placed underneath a rock, only this time it didn't just have my first name on it, but my full name. It was smeared in blood. My friend took some gloves out of her pocket and put them on to pick it up. I told her not to open it, but she didn't listen and did it anyway. She pulled out a picture. It was of me looking through my apartment window. Someone had taken a picture of me, put it in an envelope with my name on it, and then got some kid to torment me. I went inside my apartment and my friend reported this to the police. I gave up my job at the bar as the thought of walking past that cemetery alone at that time, when I knew someone had been spying on me, was terrifying. Every time I looked through the window, I'd feel sick with dread that the boy would return or that I'd catch sight of another envelope. I never saw the boy again, and I moved not long after that. I don't live near a cemetery anymore. I don't go to cemeteries unless I have to, and I make sure I'm never alone. The whole thing still gives me the creeps. Due to personal circumstances, I left my life in Detroit and went to stay with my uncle in Ohio. I didn't know how long I'd be staying there, but I didn't want to be a leech, so I asked my uncle if there were any jobs available at his place. He worked at a cemetery, managing the overall smooth running of the place. He said that due to one of the gravekeepers taking leave to care for a family member, there was a temporary position open. And seeing as I had prior experience in this kind of job, which I'd done during a college break one summer, the job was mine. I started the next day, and this other worker, Sal, a Portuguese guy in his 60s, showed me the cemetery layout. He was a man of few words and often waved and pointed instead of just saying what he wanted me to do. At first, work was a good distraction for me, but one time, when I was weeding the tombstones, I noticed this man in a suit with a black fedora hat standing by the sugar maple tree. He had his hands in his pockets and was just staring across the cemetery. I carried on with my work, and the next time I looked, the man had left. I didn't have to wait long to see him again, as later that day, during a burial, I saw that same man standing at the back of the group of mourners. He again had his hands in his pockets, and even after the service was over, he didn't engage with anyone. He just walked off across the path. I didn't think much more of this, but then a few days later, during another burial, I was working nearby when I peered over and saw something. Standing at the back of the mourners was that same man in the fedora hat with his hands in his pockets. I found myself watching, and after the service, he didn't talk to anyone and just walked off up the path. I knew it was possible that he could have known both of the people being buried, but something about it just seemed off. I told myself I was overthinking things and left it at that. But then the following week, it happened again. I was using the backhoe to dig a plot, and as usual, was getting unhelpful hand signals from Sal when I saw him peer over at something. When he turned back, he had this fearful look in his eyes. Then he clasped his hands together and started praying in Portuguese. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw a figure over by the sugar maple tree. It was that same man in the suit and fedora. He had his hands in his pockets and was staring over at us with this intense glare. Sal seemed distracted after that. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer and kept on waving orders at me. Later on, during the next burial, I looked over and saw standing at the back of the mourners was the exact same man. This time he left before the service finished, but he didn't walk across the path. He walked across the grass to where Sal was mending a tombstone. On seeing this man coming toward him, Sal sprung to his feet, looked away from him, and hurried towards the shed. The man didn't follow him. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets and watched him leave. I didn't see Sal again until my next shift. When I asked him about that man, he hung his head low and started muttering in Portuguese. He was obviously distressed, and I felt bad for upsetting him. Then Sal looked at me, and with fear evident in his eyes, he said, "Mau presagio." I looked it up afterward. It means bad omen. Then later on, I was returning from the tool house when I saw Sal staring at something in terror. It was that same man standing close to the sugar maple tree. Sal turned away from him, only as he walked away, I noticed him clutch his chest and drop to his knees. I ran over to help him. He was having a heart attack. I'll never forget the twisted fear on his face as it happened. I called for an ambulance and he was taken to the hospital. I carried on with my shift, but I found it hard to focus on anything after that. I couldn't stop seeing the look of pure, undiluted fear in Sal's eyes. Then, during a burial, I looked over and saw that man standing at the back of the mourners. He again left early and walked across the path with his hands still in his pockets. He didn't look my way or even acknowledge me, but just seeing him, I felt it. There was a darkness about him. Sadly, Sal died later that day, and even though I worked at the cemetery for the remainder of that year, I never saw the man in the fedora hat again. I don't know for sure who he was or why he was there, but I know that his presence terrified Sal. I don't work at the cemetery anymore, and I'm now back in Detroit. But sometimes, That whole situation comes into my mind, and I think about that man and wonder if Sal was right. I wonder if there really was something sinister about him, if he was a bad omen.